quite a few thousand miles from, well, not too far from where I am now. And before I bring him on, I just want to wish everyone a happy new year and a blessed new year for 2024, which I sense much prayer is needed for what we think may be unfolding next year. But thank you for joining me. So I'm just going to bring on a dear friend of mine, Gadi. So thank you. Gadi, thank you for joining me. I count it as a real privilege, and I thank you for that. And just to
Thank you.
say, no, just say to everyone, Gadi and I have actually met, and I'm very grateful and blessed for that. So, Gadi, could you explain where you are?
I am sitting in the Baptist village just outside of Petach Tikva, Israel.
Wow, wow. How many? What's the length of time that you've been over in Israel?
I came here shortly after the war broke out. I've been here about a month and a half now.
Right. We had the events on the 7th of October, and I know in talking to you, you felt that you had to respond in some way. Hence why you got on a plane from the US and then
Mhm.
have flown there. Gadi, without sounding obvious, and it's just a good way to explain things, what are your personal links with Israel?
Well, I actually grew up here in Israel.
Mm,
My family made what is called Aliyah, which is when a family immigrates to
mm,
Israel. My family made Aliyah when I was a child, so
mm,
I grew up in Israel. To me, I lived here for the important part of my years. I was 13 years old when we moved here, and I was 21 when I left. So to me, that was the growing up stage. I did a lot of growing in the United States up to the age of 13, but I think an individual is really formed once they hit those later teen years,
mm,
and definitely it the the way I grew up created the life that I have lived. So I people ask me if I could change something, would I? I saw a lot of good things, I saw a lot of bad things, but honestly, I don't think I would change anything. I'm glad of the fact that I grew up in Israel. I got to see and do more than most people do in a lifetime by the time I was 20 years old.
mm,
So, I left Israel in 1981, and I went back to the United States. My family had already gone back, and life happened. I got married, I had a child, and every time I wished I could get over to Israel, life happens. I was working and had a child, and I couldn't do it. Now my baby is 25.
right.
War broke out on October 7th,
Mm,
and it was the worst thing as far as that particular day, that massacre, October 7th, which is referred to here as Black Saturday now. Um, I immediately said, I got to go home.
mm,
And to me, this is home. This is where I grew up.
mm,
So I made the arrangements, and I've been here since I could get on a plane and get over here.
mm. When you went to America in 81, I think the Lebanon War was that the following year in 1982.
Yeah, so there were a lot of different skirmishes that occurred prior to the actual Israel-Lebanese
Mm,
war, and there were a couple of those. There was another one in the 2000s, 2005 and 6, I believe. But yes, 1982 would be when Israel went into Lebanon to push Hezbollah and the PLO at that time back beyond Beirut up to the Litani River,
mm.
because they were just lobbing, gee, what a shocker, it sounds like
Yeah,
today, they were
yeah,
just
yeah.
lobbing rockets and missiles
Mm,
into Israel at
mm,
will.
mm. The reason I bring this up, because this is important, because we've seen a load of protest on the streets in various cities in America. We've seen those protests on the streets in London and other cities
Mhm.
within the UK and around the world of these students who think they're extremely well informed and singing from the river to the sea, a genocidal trope, is perfectly acceptable. But what they have no idea then, and you do, and I think it'd just be important to bring this up, When did the civil war break out in Beirut, in Lebanon, and why did that happen from round about the mid 70s? What actually went there? What people group moved in Lebanon?
It's interesting. It goes beyond Lebanon. I will answer your question, but I'm going to kind of back up a little to answer it a little bit better. Many people in your audience may remember an outfit called Black September,
Yes.
which was a terrorist group. What they don't know is, why were they called Black September? Well, many of and I'll use the term so-called Palestinians, and I can explain why I refer to them that way later, but many of the so-called Palestinians that were living in the West Bank, what is today known as the West Bank, back when it was still part of Jordan, pre-1967, they tried to overthrow the Hussein government. King Hussein at that time was in power in Jordan. And it was a massacre. It was a horrible, bloody day. What many people don't know is, and it took place in September, which is why they named their group Black September. But what many people don't know, the only other time in history, aside from 9/11, that 4 aircraft were hijacked all on the same day was by Black September, and it was Jordanian aircraft. And King Hussein went into these refugee camps and he just slaughtered people. He did not want to put up with this uprising of these so-called Palestinians trying to overthrow his government. So many of them fled to Syria. And when they went to Syria, and people will need to Google the Middle East map, they can see that Syria sits above Israel and Jordan to the north. When they fled to Syria, they tried the same thing again. They tried to overthrow a government. Well, the Assad government would have no part of that. And they threw them out and they fled to Lebanon. And what you had in Lebanon, the PLO, the Palestine Liberation Organization, of course, Yasser Arafat, what you had was they went over and did in Lebanon what they could not achieve in Jordan or Syria. So you had this civil war. The problem that a lot of people don't understand, Lebanon used to be, and I say used to, past tense, Lebanon used to be the only Christian nation in the Middle East.
Yes.
And it was a gorgeous country. They used to call Beirut the Paris of the Middle East. It had 5-star restaurants, theaters, and nightlife, hotels. And Hezbollah, what became Hezbollah from the PLO, they created this civil war. Of course, now they're in the government, they're in the Lebanese government. Many of those from Hezbollah sit in the government. And that's what created the civil war. And people have to, just look at history, and there's no need to try and wonder, why won't Egypt take people from Gaza? Well, your answer is, look at their history. Every country they go to, they try and overthrow the government, just like Hamas did in Gaza. Because yes, they won a fair election, but how did they win that fair election? They killed all of their opponents before the election, so there was nobody else running. So, this is the way that particular group operates. When I say that particular group, I'm referring to the so-called Palestinians.
It's really important. This history is so important because this history is denied. People will not face facts. I mean, what you were saying about Jordan, and I'm, doing the research, of course. What is fascinating there, I think they even got a general from Pakistan, a gentleman called Hag, I think, to even help them with that particular incident at that time. And of course, as you're talking about Assad, I'm assuming you're talking about the fact that then Assad's father was
the current
power.
Assad's father.
Yeah, but that is important as well. This whole thing of lineage, how the power is then passed down from one to another. And then
you have the same thing in Jordan with King Hussein.
Yeah.
That goes all the way back to his grandfather. So, the Hashemite kingdom of Jordan, which was Transjordan when Israel became Israel, that goes back to the Hashemites and the Husseini family. So, this is not unusual. That was created by us. I mean, it was our own fault that that was created. And what I mean by that, if you go back to World War One, and when the Ottoman Empire ceased to exist after World War One, and all that Middle Eastern land was carved up and split up with different mandates, and you had the French mandate and the British mandate, you know, they being the United Nations, what was then the League of Nations, the precursor to the United Nations, they created these borders.
Yes.
You know, you didn't have as many problems in the Middle East back then as you do today, because everybody knew their place. Every area was run by a different tribe. And, you know, after the United Nations or the League of Nations got involved after World War One, then you had Iraq, Iran, Syria, Jordan, Lebanon, Israel. None of these countries, the only country that existed that was a country was Egypt.
So how do you view that now? Because of course, I think now in about 1922, Churchill then creates Transjordan. So this whole thing of saying to the masses, saying to the British, you have got the mandate to be in charge of, as it was then called, Palestine, which is another interesting discussion in itself, because this history is really, really important, and it's a real privilege to be able to discuss it with you while you're there and just get your viewpoint. So Transjordan is then created. That then a lot of that was land that was going to be promised to the Israeli nation. Correct me.
It had been promised.
Right.
Yes, it had been promised. It had been decided by the League of Nations and the Balfour Declaration.
Yes.
I mean, we could go back and back and back all the way to Theodore Herzl to the 1800s, when this land was decided, we're going to carve this up and give a certain amount of this land, which, by the way, what wasn't desert was infested with malaria swamp.
Absolutely.
It was a horrible piece of land. Nobody really wanted it. The Arabs that did live here didn't want to deal with it. They didn't. It was only the Jews that were trying to farm it. But, you know, that's history. If we look at how much was promised to the country of Israel prior to Israel becoming a nation in May of 1948, they only received 77% of what was guaranteed to them was cut off and given to what became Transjordan. So Israel got 77% less of what it originally was supposed to receive as a country. And each time that the area got smaller and smaller and smaller for the Jews were like, fine, we'll take it. And the Arabs said no. It didn't matter how small the land was. It was never a question of land. These wars have never been about land. The so-called Palestinian argument has never been about land. It is plain and simple. They don't want the Jews. And you don't need to take my word for it. Go and look at the laws that right now, if you were to go to what is known as the West Bank, the area of Judea and Somalia, if you go there, no Jews are allowed. I can't visit Bethlehem. I can't visit those areas. Why? Because I'm a Jew. So who's the real one that's doing the ethnic cleansing? Because Arabs certainly live in Israel. They vote in Israel. They can become police officers and judges. They're members of the parliament. But inside the Palestinian areas, Jews aren't allowed. There's a big red sign at the entrance, any of the checkpoints that go into the West Bank. And it says it is under law. No Israeli citizens can go there. No Jews can go there. So it's really interesting if people would just open their eyes and look at the truth, as opposed to the propaganda that's spewed by these so-called intelligent students on campuses across America.
Absolutely. And you know, the Nakba, the whole thing is another conversation in itself.
Yes.
Of, you know, there's just I want to come back to that just quickly. My own understanding was in 1995, in Bethlehem, 80% of the businesses there were owned by Christians. That has now flipped to completely the opposite. Yes?
Yes. And so much so, it's interesting. Every year, Bethlehem, as an example, Bethlehem is the name of the town in Hebrew, Bethlehem in English. It relies on tourists at Christmas. Christians from all over the world flock to Bethlehem. This year, there were none. Was that because of the Christians saying we're not going to celebrate Christmas? Absolutely not. It was because the Palestinian Authority told the Christians, we're not going to have celebrations this year. There was no trees, there was no lights, there were no tourists. And why did they do that? They said it's in recognition of our brothers in Gaza. So who got hurt in that? Not the Palestinians that live in the West Bank, the Christians that live in the West Bank that rely on those tourist dollars. They didn't even have any tourism.
So this is what's really important. And because the fact that it is not about the land, it's about the fact that we don't want Jews there, period. We don't want Israel. We want complete annihilation. And then
that's not even from me. All you have to do is listen to what they say.
Yeah.
They publicly come out and say this. You know, they're not going to be happy until they turn the Mediterranean Ocean red with the blood of the Jews. These are their terms, these are their words, not mine.
So breaking down when we see these students who think they're extremely informed and profoundly ill-informed, and where they're suddenly going on this intersectionality rant and suddenly going, look at a bunch of colonialists, e.g. that's Israel, they've gone in there and taken this land, then they have no understanding of the Ottoman Empire. They have no understanding of the state of the land, that it was malaria invested, that due to the skills and the doctors of Jewish doctors then creating medicines that could be taken to stop the spread of malaria and all the rest, that is all there. And then, as you quite rightly hint at, we remember Mark Twain going through the land and describing that no one was here and all the rest. Why am I laboring this? The reason why I'm laboring this is because you and I'm privileged to, again, I cannot say it enough, privileged to have this conversation, and we have to inform people. We have to work hard, and you do, to get our facts right, because we are so manipulated. So when I'm listening to people like Mordecai Kepler, I think, and then you've got other historians as well. Mordecai is an incredible expert. Then you've got in Islamic Jewish relations and all the rest, and will go on Arabic TV and quite rightly defend Israel's point of view. But then you've got other historians like Benny Morris who talk about, as you said, we said about the Nakba, we're talking about people, what happened in war. They were told, the Palestinians then, as they call themselves, would say residents then of the land there, of Palestine then as it was, they turn around and go, well, we're just going to disappear. Jordan said it won't be long. They'll deal with the Jews and then we can come back to our homes. The last thing I want to see is any civilian or anything, anybody hurt. That's the last thing on both sides or militarily. That's the last thing. However, in war, that's the decision they made. But what people do not then remind themselves of the fact that 150,000 Arabs decided to stay in Israel. That's a figure that's talked about. They decided to stay. Others then left. And as you rightly say, there are, I think, 2 million Arab Israeli citizens that live within Israel. This is really, really important. If there was a genocide agenda going on, how come that the population of Gaza has increased so much, Gadi? Because they're then not doing a very good job, are they?
No, you know, it's funny, and you brought up the number of 2 million, and when I lived here, because I left in 1981, so let's think about that. You know, it was 42 years ago that I left Israel, 2023. When I left, there was less than 1 million Arabs in Israel that were citizens. Now there's over 2 million. So obviously there's no ethnic cleansing or apartheid going on here in Israel.
No.
and also there's a lot of different graphs and memes and things like that on Facebook. I even have posted some showing all the different Arab nations around Israel and what the Jewish population was pre-1948, pre-Israel becoming a country, and how many Jews lived in those countries and how many are there now. And then it compares it to Israel, how many Arabs were here, Muslims were here, and how many are here now. And the only place where that number has risen is in Israel for the number of Muslims. Not only do they have the same rights as all Israeli citizens, the female Arabs, the female Muslims, I shouldn't say Arabs because you have Jewish Arabs and Christian Arabs, but the female Muslims have more rights in Israel than they do in any other Muslim nation, starting with the fact that they can drive. They can go out without a chaperone. They can work. I mean, they have all the exact same rights as anybody living in the United States would have here in Israel, because it is a democratic nation. And, people don't realize that. What women do here in Israel, if they were Muslim in a Muslim country, they'd be in jail or beheaded. And people don't realize that. That still goes on today. There is still a square in Saudi Arabia where they behead people. This is part of Sharia law, and people have no concept, and they're screaming, from the river to the sea. They have no clue what they're talking about. Most of them don't even know what river or sea borders Israel, let alone what that saying means.
How did it make you feel seeing the young people coming out with that and all this representation of history on the streets of America? Were you surprised or not?
I really wasn't surprised, given the things that I've seen over the years in the United States and what has happened to the education system in the United States, not just in our universities and colleges, but even our high schools, junior high schools, and elementary schools. Having said that, what surprised me was some of the people that were jumping on that bandwagon, and I'll give you a perfect example, the LGBTQ community. Do they not have any concept that the fact that they are lesbians, gays, or homosexuals, if they were in any Islamic country, name one, they would be immediately either tied to a chair and thrown off a rooftop or beheaded? They have no concept. They're screaming for the rights of Palestinians, but yet if they were in Palestine, they'd be killed. Why? Because of their choice of lifestyle. They have no understanding whatsoever. So I wasn't so much surprised to see all these so-called intellectual students going out there and marching in favor of Hamas in Palestine. I was more surprised at some of the groups that were joining those students, because they themselves wouldn't live a day in any Muslim nation.
Queers for Palestine being
exactly
one of those groups, and it is what we're saying is a complete and utter oxymoron.
It's a total oxymoron.
Yeah, totally, because they do not understand what has gone on. What was your reaction, because you heard about it, to the three university, one of them's resigned now, but of course Penn and Harvard, and I've forgotten the other university, those three heads before a congressional committee? What were your reactions to that?
My reaction is, it depends on the context.
Well,
I mean, it's a word game.
Yes.
It's a word game.
Yes.
If let's just replace the word Jew with African American, and let's see how long that would last.
That would
last. Is it okay to scream from any university for the genocide of Black people? Absolutely not. And it wouldn't last. But if you say Jew, well, it depends on the context. Give me a break.
Well, the fact
that
we
replace the word Jew with any group of nationality, and it would be uncalled for. It would be unheard of. They wouldn't allow it.
Well, this is what is so shocking. This is what, despicable events of the 7th of October and what happened and what we've witnessed and video footage and all the rest and GoPros. And we can't even get our mind around it, to be honest, except it's completely evil and psychopathic. What then came out, and then within 48 hours, it was asking the Israeli government to show restraint. And then this whole thing of the way the press literally pivoted to bordering on, well, we need more proof of what happened. We need more proof. What was the what's the feeling within Israel, even though you weren't over there at that time, but of course you've been having discussions with people. How do Israelis view that?
You know, I don't think most Israelis were surprised at the world's reaction because it goes on time after time after time. Each and every time throughout history, if you go back just to 2014, which was the last time that there was a big skirmish, for lack of a better term. It wasn't really a war. It was an operation, as they called it, against Hamas. It was for all the thousands of rockets that were daily coming into Israel. Israel saw what happened. The world right away screamed as soon as Israel tries to defend itself. It's not attacking them, it's defending itself. And in order to defend itself, well, we're going to need to go in and we're going to need to blow up the areas that are shooting rockets. Makes perfect sense. Any country would do that. And the Israelis see each and every time what happens. The International Court in Hague says, oh, it's war crimes. Oh, civilians are getting killed. Well, need I remind you about World War II and Berlin being carpet bombed? Need I remind you about World War II and Nagasaki and Hiroshima? People die in war, and I'm not saying we're advocating that that's the right thing, but no other country in the world, no, and this is not just Gadi speaking, no other country in the world, this has been said by American generals and presidents, this has been said by British generals that have been here and seen how Israel operates. People, generals and presidents and leaders of other countries have all seen what Israel does prior to going in to an area during wartime and the way that they try and protect civilian life. And you need to remember, what is Hamas? Hamas doesn't walk around Gaza wearing black outfits with a green bandana. No, they're citizens. They're dressed in T-shirts and jeans. So how do you differentiate a terrorist from a civilian? Civilians are going to die. No one wants to see that, okay? But let's remember what happened on October 7th. 1,400 civilians were not only killed in Israel, were murdered because there was no war. They came across the border and massacred them. Over 350 in one area that were all teenagers at a music festival. Aside from that, let's talk about the mutilation of the bodies before, during, and after their death. Let's talk about babies being burned in front of their parents, and then the other children being forced to watch as Hamas killed their parents. You know, the raping that went on, and you know, some of the things that I have seen, and I know I discussed this with you, Mark, in the past, but since I've been here, I have managed to see a lot more videos of what did not make the mainstream media because it was too atrocious. It would never pass the groups that say what can and can't be allowed on public television.
Absolutely.
And I have seen things. There were women that were so brutally raped that their pelvises were broken. I want people to think about that. And not just women. They did it to little girls and little boys. This is the evilness. There is no word in the English language to describe what Hamas did on October 7th to Israel. So now Israel, the Israeli Defense Force, notice they're not called the Israeli Attack Army. It's the Israeli Defense Force. All they want to do is defend their own land. That's all they've ever asked for since 1948. Leave us in peace and we'll leave you alone. Now the Israeli Defense Force goes in to try and eliminate the threat of Hamas, and the world is like, oh, ceasefire, stop. What other nation in the world would stop?
Well, because the whole thing, I want to discuss this with you on future occasions, because it's a review of history and why. And if you then build in to the United Nations such hatred, and that there are so many policies of trying to think of the correct term, so many, so many sort of edicts against Israel. Israel has had more edicts against it via the UN than any other nation in the world. And then it's discussing, you know, UNRWA, discussing the Hamas links with UNRWA, who is actually running Gaza, how it is actually run. And I've had, one particular conversation that was not pleasant, because I won't back down on this when I'm having a discussion with someone who goes, Israel has just bombed a hospital. No, it hasn't. Yes, it has. I've seen it. Hear me, Gadi. You'll be shocked. They saw it on the BBC News, and as it was on the BBC, they thought that the BBC was reporting the truth. Well,
Yes.
I disavowed them of that. The fact that a rocket is misfired from Hamas and ends in a car park of the hospital, and this goes on and on and on and on and on. And then the terror network, and people, no understanding of where is this money come from, being funded from America, being funded from Europe. Now, and I want to say this publicly and say this to you, that when we first got to know each other in 2015, and I was blessed to come on a radio show with you, where you challenged me and you talked about Islam. And that's what we're talking about. This is a clash of civilizations.
Yes.
And people have to realize that. And in a clash of civilizations, of course, there is collateral damage. But people have to remember, within Europe, the Islamic marauding armies going all the way up to northern Spain. The psychology says that was our land. We wish to have this back. So Hamas wants a worldwide caliphate. That's what they then want. Gadi, can you please explain to, if we're able to influence any misguided, well-informed students, as they call themselves, on the streets, could you explain to me, to them, how many times the so-called Palestinians have been offered a two-state solution?
Oh my gosh.
We could argue with us. We could say 1936, 1947. We may even say 1956, but definitely I think 67, 2000, 2005. I'm not saying this to be clever. What I'm saying is there's at least six different occasions.
More than that, but yes. And I'd like to explain why I say, always in quotes, the so-called Palestinians.
Yeah.
Let me explain that briefly. There was an area under the British mandate pre-1948, May 15th of 1948 to be exact, that was called Palestine. It did not have its own president. It did not have its own flag. It did not have its own mayor. It did not have its own anything. It was a mandate, just such as Syria and Lebanon were under the French mandate. Okay. Having said that, there were people that were born and lived in this British mandate known as Palestine. They were Palestinians. If you were born in that mandate, in that area, pre-1948, you were a Palestinian. You could have been a Jewish Palestinian, a Muslim Palestinian, or a Christian Palestinian, but you were a Palestinian. Now, if I lived in Texas and I said I was Mexican because Mexico once owned Texas.
Yep.
Does that make me Mexican? No. And I'm no more Mexican than the people that claim they're Palestinian today. And that, again, That doesn't come from Gadi. You can look up where the Palestinian Authority themselves, their own scholars, their own imams, have come out and said, we're not Palestinians. We're Syrians, we're Egyptians, we're Saudi Arabians. We're not Palestinians. There is no such thing. How many times is Palestine mentioned in the Bible? None. How many times, better yet, is it mentioned in the Quran? None. Why? Because there's no such place. It was a mandate. So I get very frustrated when people say to me, I'm Palestinian. Really? When were you born? Because you don't look a day over 20. So obviously you weren't born pre-1948. If you were, I'd call you a Palestinian if you were born here pre-1948. But to say all Palestinians are Arabs or all Palestinians are Muslims, that's not fair to the Christians and the Jews that were born in this area that were Palestinians. So, yes, there was an area called Palestine. But to answer your question about the two-state solution, it happened. It already happened. You mentioned at the beginning of the show how much land was taken away from the Jews and given to what was then called Transjordan. Do you know why they did that? I know you know why, but many in your audience probably don't know, because that was for the Arab Palestinians. In the last census that Jordan, the country of Jordan, had, in their very last census, which was just a few years ago, over 80% of their population checked off that they were Palestinian. How did Jordan get full of Palestinians? Because that was the country that was created side by side with Israel as a two-state solution. And they already were given that. Those that were living in the West Bank area, who set up those refugee camps? Israel didn't set up those refugee camps. Israel had nothing to do with the West Bank in 1948. The Jordanian government set up those refugee camps. Who set up the refugee camps in Gaza? That wasn't Israel. Israel didn't have Gaza then. Not in 1948. That was Egypt. You know, people need to learn history. And who was the one that actually gave the money to set up these temporary refugee camps? UNRWA, the UNRWA, the United Nations Relief Work Agency, was set up temporarily in 1950 to deal with the Palestinian people that fled their homes because of the Arabs attacking the new state of Israel. And it was supposed to be temporary, and it still exists today. And who created that problem?
Because
the Jews get the blame, but we didn't do it.
Absolutely, because the definition of running a refugee relief organization like UNRWA is to actually solve the problem. It's not to increase the refugee number, which is happening because, as you know, it's passed from one generation to another.
Exactly.
I am now the honorary refugee 3 generations for whatever removed. This but again you've said let's re-emphasize this. Has Israel started any war? The answer is no.
Technically.
Right.
Technically. In 1967, to be fair for the people that are watching the show that might argue it, Israel did attack first, but it was called a preemptive strike. Egypt, Syria, and Jordan have all admitted over the years that, yes, they were planning to attack Israel. Israel got the jump on them and attacked a couple of days before they were able to. But it was obvious, even back then, they were massing on the borders. There was an attack emanating, and Israel did attack in 1967, known as the Six-Day War. They attacked first. But that was the only time, if you want to say, they started a war.
Right. So correct me here. So within that war of 67, were they within 100 miles of Cairo? And then as part of negotiations after, they then hand back. So here you go, a victorious army, which is every aggressor on every single side. They hand back land back to the person that they have, the body, the country that they have just defeated. So in 67. What about in 1973 in regard
That was even worse.
Right.
In 1973, they were 10 miles from Damascus and Cairo. Think about that. That's how far Israel got into the foreign, because Jordan was not involved in 1973 Yom Kippur War, but Syria and Egypt, they were 10 miles from their capital, and they gave it all back. And then, of course, the Sinai Desert, which Israel captured in the Yom Kippur War, was given back in full, which made Israel 3 times smaller than it was. It was given back to Anwar Sadat during the 1979 to 1980 peace agreement. And interestingly enough, Israel not only offered, but begged Sadat to take Gaza. And he said, Gaza's off the table. If Gaza's part of this deal, there's no deal. And that's a fact. People can Google it.
Absolutely.
That was the biggest problem in Camp David with Anwar Sadat was the argument over whether or not he would take Gaza.
But this is the important thing, because we are going through history, and I want to go through this, and there are so many roads to go down. I'm not going to say rabbit warrens because they don't exist, because the history is there. And you, thank you for bringing that up, which is no, Egypt were asked to take back Gaza, but they refused to do it. And also the other thing is, what nationality was Arafat, my friend? What nationality was he? Egyptian. Let's think about this. Then again, and you have, you've warned about this. Other people that have warned about this. Then we've got this group called the Muslim Brotherhood, and
which is outlawed in Egypt.
Exactly. Hence why the last thing they want, I think, it is the Rafah Gate there. They want that opening opened, and the last thing they want is Gazans to move from there into Egypt, because they're concerned about who is going, how many members of Hamas are going to be embedded there.
Exactly. So you've got a situation where Hamas is the Muslim Brotherhood, and the Muslim Brotherhood was outlawed in Egypt. So now they're there again. It's obvious that they're there again. I mean, the current government is partly Muslim Brotherhood, but that's a whole other story from the coup that happened there a few years back. But at the time of Anwar Sadat and his predecessors, the Muslim Brotherhood was illegal in Egypt. The second in command of Al Qaeda, what was his name? Dr. Zawahiri. He was part of the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt. That's where he was jailed. And that's where he started to learn and become friends with what later became the heads of Al Qaeda. Right. So, the Muslim Brotherhood, they've got their grubby little fingers everywhere. Unfortunately, they're in the United States.
I was about to say that, because there are things I could say, which I know that and we could then have this discussion, and it is a very important discussion, because let's just, in the last few minutes, I'm just going to pivot to London and say facts.
Yes.
So as the incredible Douglas Murray, one of our wonderful British journalists, is in Israel, been in and out of Israel, I believe, is in there now. And I'm just looking to the right, because there was a book I was going to just quickly show. I'll see if I can find it in a minute. But this whole thing of then the incredible Melanie Phillips, who lives, British journalist, but lives in Israel, and another brilliant advocate. Now, as Melanie has written a book called London Starn, and Douglas has brought this out recently, because of the marches on the streets of London. Suddenly, and we have to understand the link between the left getting together with Gazans, Islam, this whole thing, which is a huge subject, which is very important in itself. We then have someone living in North London called Mohammed Sawala, and Mohammed Sawala was either on the board of military wing of, well, they're not a military, it's all military, of the Muslim of Hamas, and he now lives North London. We then have another individual further out from North London that was responsible for the fatwa on Salman Rushdie, and as Douglas pointed out, the fatwa is like the length of a book, and he was then the fatwa to then kill him. The individual that did that, linked with the Iranian regime, lives in the UK, and we're all going. You've been talking about this for many years. I'll just say that, but people suddenly waking up to this isn't a good idea. No, because
Right.
when you've got a jihadist group on the streets of London that is banned in other European countries, and one particular individual is also a doctor within the National Health Service. I'm not saying that anything that isn't out there, because it's already out there in the
Hmm.
mainstream, because even Piers Morgan has interviewed these
Yes.
people. That's another subject, but you can see it. We are not making any of this up. And when I say that this is a clash of civilizations, I don't think I'm making that up either.
No, it's definitely a clash of civilizations. This is something I've been screaming about since I first came back to the US when I was in the US. I came
Mm,
back to the US in 1981 from Israel, and I was screaming and everybody just called me, you're a Muslim hater, you're crazy, you're
mm,
nuts.
mm,
You have no idea what you're talking about.
mm,
It wasn't until 1993, when the World Trade Center bombing occurred, that slowly my phone started to ring and people were like, where was that crazy guy that warned us about this? And
mm,
of course, after 9/11, my phone rang off the hook. Then all
mm,
of a sudden I was an expert. You know what amazed me? I used to sit in front of my TV on after 9/11 and I used to scream at my television. Didn't matter what channel I turned. Every single channel had a terrorism expert on. What was there a population explosion of terrorism experts after
mm,
9/11?
mm,
All of a sudden, we had all these terrorism experts, and I used to sit and scream at my TV. If you're such an expert, it never would have happened. You guys weren't around.
mm,
All of a sudden, you read one book, you're an expert. I have been screaming about terrorism and Islam since 1981. And it took two different acts of terrorism for me to even make it on the map and have a radio show and get interviewed and do
mm,
articles.
mm,
So people, I despise these people. I never refer to myself as an expert. Other people can call me that, that's fine. I've never once said I'm an expert on
mm,
Islam or terrorism.
mm,
I
mm,
know a lot. I know a lot more than most people.
mm,
But these other people that are out there don't know their butt from a hole in the ground, and
mm,
they're claiming to be experts on terrorism. Why? Because they read one book or they visited some Muslim nation.
mm.
They have no concept, no concept. I taught the Joint Terrorism Task Force,
Yeah.
and what amazed me was these were people that had already been through counterterrorism training who knew absolutely nothing about Islam. And it's like, how are you going to protect the United States from an Islamic jihadist attack when you don't even know what the word jihad means? It was mind boggling. So, the United States has a lot to learn, unfortunately. And right now, with their southern border wide open, it's not a question of did any terrorists cross? It's a question of how many terrorists have crossed. And I'm afraid that the next 9/11 isn't a matter of if it's going to happen, it's when. And it's going to be way worse because there are so many thousands of possible terrorists running around the United States right now, acting possibly your neighbors, and people in America don't even know it. And when they get the call and they get the notification to do such and such, what we saw happen in Israel on October 7th, it's going to be way bigger in America. And that's my biggest fear.
No, I totally I totally respect that, and I know that is your biggest fear, and I'm not. You care, understandably, you care passionately about that, and that at times has been costly, because if
Mhm.
we're up late at night worrying about these things, we're not getting much sleep. And let's just be honest, because this is a concern, and you're
what
upset,
is
and
what is sleep? What's
what
that
is
word?
sleep? I hear you. I hear you. Gadi, I'm conscious of your time, but I'm very I just feel really privileged to be able to have this conversation, because the reason being, history is so important. History is so important. Facts are
Hmm.
so important, and we're seeing how they're being manipulated. So in the last sort of few seconds, and I'm trying to keep it to 50 minutes as near as possible, but we're just at 50 minutes now. Is there any other comment now you want to say? Because I really want to be able to do this again, if that's okay with you,
Oh yeah,
because
absolutely.
this is such an important to me conversation, and I am going to use the word. I'll use the word expert of someone who is extremely well informed in regard to history, and you try and work at it, and you work at it in regard to the questions you're asking, because there's been nothing worse than seeing, as you say, these experts and ill-informed people talking on television or wherever. There's nothing
Hmm.
worse.
Yeah, and first I want to wish you and all your viewers a happy, healthy, prosperous, and hopefully peaceful New Year. May everybody have a wonderful year. And I always, I'm praying for the hostages day in and day out. There's
Mm.
still about 128 hostages that are in Gaza. Um, my phone is going crazy here. Pardon me. And of course, the soldiers. We've been lucky today. I believe there were only 3 rocket alerts today, which is the same as yesterday. But I haven't checked my phone in a while. I had my phone originally when I was in the United States, and when you and I met there, you may
Mm.
remember my phone was set for all of Israel. So
Mm.
anytime there was a rocket alert, it would
Yeah,
go off. Well,
yeah.
now that I'm in Israel, I won't do that, and I can't do that because I'd be running for a shelter every 5 seconds. So I have
I
on
hear
my
you.
app on my phone, I have it set to my GPS location. So wherever I am, if there's a rocket alert, it'll go off.
Mm.
So I haven't checked my phone, so I honestly don't know in the last hour what has happened. We have lost a lot. It's been over 500 soldiers in Gaza. And I want to explain very quickly, if I can, and I know you were trying to keep it at 50,
Mm.
so I apologize.
Don't worry.
When I give my daily updates on Facebook, people will hear me give numbers as low as 150, 160, and then they'll hear me give numbers over 500 as far as soldiers that have been killed in the war. The reason there's 2 different numbers, and I've explained this in my videos on Facebook,
Mm.
there were many soldiers killed on October 7th while they slept in their
Yeah,
base,
yeah.
met hundreds. So you've got a high number of well over 500 that have died overall total,
Mm.
counting October 7th. Then you have the lower number of 100 and something that has been since Israel actually invaded Gaza. So
Mm.
there's 2 different numbers. And obviously, for the reasons of being fair to everyone whose lives were lost, I count the higher number. It's only fair. I mean, there were soldiers that did try and do something on October 7th that were killed. A lot of people don't know about all the police officers that died. There was a police station in the town of Sderot
Mm.
where the
Mm.
terrorists actually got to that town and they killed every single member inside. They burned the entire police station down. They had to bulldoze it. There was nothing
Yeah, I
left.
remember, and the police station's on the corner of the street, wasn't it? And then they
Yes.
bulldozed that. But
I've
yeah,
been there. I've
yeah.
seen that. I don't know if you saw my video when I was down in Sderot,
Yes,
and
yes.
I went to the
Yeah,
bus stop where people
yep,
had died.
yep, yep.
People have no concept of what
Mm.
took place on October
No.
7th. And this is what cracks me up when they use the term that Israel needs to use. What do they call that? Equivalent force.
Restraint. Oh, equivalent. Yeah, yeah, yeah. Restraint.
There's a word for it. I forget what they
Yeah,
use. It's not
yeah.
equivalent, but
Mm.
they don't want Israel to use more force than Israel is using more
Mm.
force. And I'm like, do you have any idea what took place?
Mm.
Because Israel is using about 10,000 times less force than what
Mm.
Hamas did on October 7th, because
Mm.
Hamas massacred women, children, the elderly, civilians, people that were hiding in bomb shelters. They burned them, they massacred them, they chopped them up into pieces. I mean, the atrocities go on and on and on. And they're like, oh, well, you've proportionate. That's the word.
Yeah,
Proportionate
proportionate.
force. It's like, if
Proportionality.
you want to
Yeah.
talk about proportionate, Israel is being kind. Because in my opinion, they could have gone in and leveled Hamas in
Mm.
Gaza, and that would have been the end of it, and that would have been proportionate. So, I don't want to hear these people argue about proportionate until they get behind a gun and have to point it at another human being, and they don't know if that human being is a terrorist or not because they're dressed like a civilian. Don't talk to me about civilian casualties.
No, not at all. And also, no, and I just thank you for your explanation on that. Gadi, I'm going to end it now if you don't mind, but I want to continue with this because it is such a privilege to talk to you, but explaining what is going on while you are there, because you then have the feel and you have the emotions of it, which may sound a daft thing to say, but through a screen, sometimes it seems that you are so many steps removed from it, but you're not. So thank you.
And very, very quickly, thank you. And I will be more than happy to come back anytime you want, Mark. One of the things you and I talked before we came on the air, and we totally forgot to mention, the reason I'm in this Baptist village is this is a place that has dormitories that are empty. And many of the displaced refugees from Israel, from up north and down south, that were evacuated from their homes due to the war, they're living here. So my way of helping is I'm helping take care of all these families that are living here. So that is something we forgot to mention, was the 100,000 people in Israel.
Absolutely, and I'm glad you have. And I'll tell you what, in our next discussion, let's start from that point because this is really important. Yes. All right, my friend, fantastic to see you, and thank you for joining me. And I'm just going to play us out, and thank you everyone for
thank you and Happy New Year.
And Happy New Year, my friend. Take care. Be safe, please. Bless you.
God bless.
Bless.